Well, good early evening, everybody in Bratislava and Berlin, and good morning in San Francisco or the Bay Area, if that's the case, to Francis Fukuyama. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody here in the audience. I just remind you that we have an online audience, and you can ask questions using the GLOBSEC app. And I think that those people who are here actually have that demonstrated to them, so please feel free, and I will endeavor to read out questions as this conversation goes on. Now, unfortunately, of course, we only have 35 minutes, so we are going to have to be relatively quick in our answers and our questions, and so I would ask everybody if they could to respect that for the purposes of a good discussion. There's very little that can be got out of a discussion about democracy these days, in my opinion, if simply we're just going to sit here and lament. And I think it's even worse if we're going to sit here and blame the public. I want to try and drive this discussion in the direction of what it is that the public or sections of the public have against the mainstream, against the establishment. But much more importantly than that, do they have just cause? I think it's very easy, and this is one of the dangers. I fall into it myself of talking about populists. I actually think this discussion would be a lot better if we abolished the word populist from it, since it seems to cover so many different bases. But I really think that if we're going to get something out of the next 30 minutes, I think we should try and do something which isn't very often done, which is actually try and look at things, to employ empathy and try and see what it is that sections of the public have against the mainstream, and do they in fact have a point. As you can see on your programs to discuss this, we have Francis Fukuyama from Stanford University. Thank you very much for joining us, particularly at this early hour where you are. We have Sandra Breka, CEO of the Robert Bosch Stiftung, joining us from Berlin. Thank you very much also for being with us today. And here in Bratislava, we have Jakub Wisniewski. Thank you, Jakub, for being here. Jakub is the Vice President of GLOBSEC. So let me just go straight in then with this question. Why do people distrust our democracies, and do they have just cause? Francis Fukuyama.
I think that there's been this big debate over the last few years as to whether that distrust is driven by primarily economic or primarily cultural reasons. I think that both of them are at play because obviously globalization has disrupted a lot of jobs and created a lot of inequality. But I do think that the cultural dimensions are ones that are really critical to understand, that there's a huge social divide that's opened up between better educated people living in cosmopolitan urban areas with lots of access to the global economy and people that live in second and third tier towns and villages or in the countryside. And that has generally been the social base of most of the populist voters. And I think that the cultural, you wanted to distinguish between, in a sense, legitimate and illegitimate sources of anger. I think that, we would all regard kind of racism against immigrants or racial minorities or women or LGBT people as illegitimate. But it's also important to understand that that cultural divide has also produced a kind of lack of understanding of the struggles that especially working class people, that don't have access to globalization to the same extent have felt. And a lot of the anger, I think, is justified as a result of, what's really the arrogance of people that have more liberal views. And in fact, denouncing populist voters simply as a group as racist or xenophobes, I think adds to that perception of a kind of social contempt.
Do you think also, just to ask a follow-up question to that, I mean, there's the social dimension, the class dimension, and you mentioned, which is often mentioned in this discussion about globalization and those that have been left behind, and you also drew the distinction between liberal metropolitan elites. I live in Washington, D.C., where I believe 93% of the population voted for Donald Trump, and I'm not sure whether Trump got more than the libertarian candidate, but it was a close-run thing. What about the dimension that it isn't just that there might be a sense that our democracies in the era of the digital revolution, when people have access to the conversation in the way they never have before, but the levers of power are pretty much the same. I mean, the American Constitution is a particularly interesting example. It's almost frozen in time how America does its politics, despite changes, obviously, in some respects. I mean, are our democracies outdated?
Well, in a certain sense, technological change has fueled a real scrambling of democratic discourse, and that is something that is genuinely new. When the internet was first introduced in the 1990s, we thought that this would be a big boon to democracy because everybody would have access to information and therefore to power, but we've now seen the ways in which it can be weaponized. And in the United States today, something like a third of American voters believe a completely false narrative that last November's presidential election was fraudulent and that Donald Trump actually won it. And I don't think this would have been remotely possible 20 years ago when you had a kind of domination by legacy media that acted as a filter for information. And we haven't figured out how to deal with this. You know, we're putting pressure on the big internet platforms to moderate that content, but I think in the end that's not an acceptable solution for a modern democracy. So in that sense, I think it is absolutely the case that the political institutions really have not kept up with the kinds of social and technological changes that we've experienced.
Sandra, Breka in Berlin, I'm certainly not asking you simply to talk about Germany, although Germany is a very important, in some would say, the key democracy in continental Europe. But from where you're sitting and how you observe this problem of disillusionment amongst significant sections, not entirely true of the whole of the population, but significant sections of the population, do you think, and to what extent do you think that there are actually the people who have a complaint have just cause?
Thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Well, you know, as Francis Fukuyama just said, one of the strongest drivers of polarization is inequality in all of its different dimensions, both within societies and internationally. And these inequalities have been exposed and further exacerbated by the pandemic. I think we've seen how, you know, strong these inequalities are. We have to acknowledge the inequalities which are real or which we consider real, but also understand that they are no less relevant if they're a matter of perception. They're as important. So yes, you know, there is just cause. We need to assess societies individually. You just spoke about Germany, so I think it's very important to look at societies individually and not have one theory for all with their social, political, and cultural context and history in mind, and apply contextualized measures if you talk about really how to address these issues and learn from each other. I think one very important aspect is that we usually pay special attention to those segments of society which are considered as polarized on one or the other side of the spectrum. We recently commissioned a study to better understand who the ambivalent, though not anti-democratic groups are. And the study, which covered Germany, France, Britain, Poland, and the US, and focused on those segments of society that feel left out of democracy or are disappointed by its results. These groups still also have an, ambivalent positions, and reaching them is crucial as they are of a relevant size almost everywhere, from 23% in Germany up to 51% in Poland. They offer considerable potential to play a role in overcoming polarization. I mean, our societies are not all black and white. And we have to support citizens to receive the competences and learn the competences to participate in the analog and digital worlds, and have the skill sets, like the ability to compromise, to endure ambiguities and rapid change, as well as the increasing complexity of issues, which fuels frustration in addition to the inequality I just mentioned. The likelihood of engaging with someone who has completely different opinions is decreasing. And real-time, face-to-face conversations have proven to be so highly effective, dismantling the biases, prejudices, and stereotypes that fuel division. So dialogue is important. We need to find, I think, credible formats of direct participation, and I mean this very seriously, which complement established formats of representative democracies. So, deliberative practice is important, and all of us who are working in these fields have responsibilities to reach out to different target groups and to seek for new ways which complement what we already have in terms of democratic practice.
Sandra, I know you don't speak for the European Union, but I'm sure you make of the European Union a central part of your thinking and the way you look at politics in Europe, since anybody who's sensible does exactly that. In terms of this question of just cause, and I think Francis Fukuyama raised an absolutely crucial point about distinguishing between the kind of criticisms of the status quo, the establishment, mainstream, call this what you want, which are fundamentally unacceptable, which is racially driven, gender driven, homophobic, this kind of thing, and those which actually are in part perhaps a cry from the depths, a plea from people who are dispossessed and poor and simply don't feel they have a stake in society. But there are political questions, aren't there? There are political questions of legitimacy. And I was just having a conversation here at GLOBSEC this afternoon about where things went wrong in the 2000s in the European Union with repeat referendums. Ireland was famously asked twice to repeat referendums when it didn't give a result that Brussels wanted. There are all the shenanigans over the Lisbon Treaty. The public were watching this. Do you not think that there is a part of the whole way that the establishment itself has been behaving in the last couple of decades that does give some just cause for concern about the way our politics is run?
Well, in particular, last year, I think the European Union made one of the big mistakes of not showing much solidarity in the pandemic, and also not necessarily the mobility and the fast responses that you would need to really actually cater to citizens' interests, to protect citizens in an equal manner. You're absolutely right, Robin, in saying that there is a disconnect between citizens and public elites. And that is very strong in terms of the European Union institutions, and different from country to country. What it does is it erodes, public trust. And that is a huge issue that we have to face. If you look at the crisis of trust that we have, not only within countries, but also in the European Union, it has been increasing. But we also have to say that irrespective of political systems, delivery of government services, and this also goes to European Union services to citizens, and the ability of a state or of a union to protect its citizens are defining factors in whether people have trust. I guess in terms of the European Union, there is a matter of representation and legitimacy, and we've, had discussions around this for many, many years. There is an issue of solidarity, which people don't see, and there is, the lack of fast response, and also a risk aversion that the European Union has shown, which doesn't necessarily fuel trust.
Let me just turn quickly to Jakub Wisniewski here in Bratislava. We are going to go in a few minutes to a member of our online audience, but I wanted to ask you, Jakub, I've been coming to, and I've actually lived in this part of the world for a long time, and I used to argue, certainly back in the 90s and the 2000s, that Central Eastern Europe was materially behind, but conceptually ahead, in the sense that the political intelligentsia here, my impression was more original in its thinking, had been schooled, school of hard knocks, of course, under communism, actually understood certain things that the West European intelligentsia was perhaps a little less able to understand, and particularly when you see issues like Belarus today, I think it's the Central East Europeans that really step up because they understand what the heck's going on over there. Here in Central and Eastern Europe, where is the disconnect taking place and why. We clearly have a major problem in the country to our immediate south, in Hungary. Perhaps you can shed some light on the good sides and the bad sides to this question that we've been discussing.
Right. It seems to me that the problems of Central Eastern Europe are not radically different from these of developed countries, be it America or Western Europe. They are simply more complicated, more profound, given the immaturity of democratic institutions and smaller preparedness of the civil society to face certain populist moves on the part of establishment. I'm not saying that the populists are more represented here in this part of the world. What I'm saying is that there is less of a protection in as regards institutions against populists, and I think COVID further complicated matters because there is always a temptation on the part of this or that government to say, massage the figures so that they look nice, or to manipulate the date of the elections so that they can happen in the exact moment when the government wants it. Or imagine some by-elections in some region where suddenly many more vaccines are available in comparison to what is available in other regions. And this is thanks to the governments. So this temptation is so strong that there is some governments cannot resist it, which leads to the further deterioration of standards of democracy, and in turn it leads to deterioration to the levels of trust. Our research proves it, that there is a big difference between moods and attitudes of say Bulgarian, Romanian, but also Polish and Czech society versus the one that we study, which is representing Western Europe, that is Austria. So, for example, if you measure the trust in government saying the truth, if you measure the prevalence of certain conspiracy theories, for example, that it's the whole COVID does not exist, it's just a fake, we can see that Central Eastern Europe is full of this confusion, and people seem not to have authorities, moral authorities, intellectual authorities to turn to, which is always problematic. I am myself as a citizen, I'm often confused whether government is not massaging certain figures, unfortunately.
Well, sometimes they actually do massage figures, so you're not always being irrational when you distrust the government. I mean, governments are sometimes dishonest, and we know that because scandal is something that anybody who grows up with politics in Western society is a word that actually has real meaning. I just wanted to jump into the online audience. We have a question from Mauricio in Mexico.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm Mauricio from the Mexico Research Center for Peace. My question is regarding the mass media. Part of the phenomenon is a deep distrust in mass media and what Yael Abrams has called the traditional narrators of truth. So what would you recommend? That's something that in Mexico we have studied very, very deeply, the disconnection between people and the mass media. What would you recommend to traditional media to rebuild trust in truth, in data and science? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was going to turn to the question of actually what to do in terms of policy, but it's good to sort of, well, this is what the media is. The media is a medium. So this will be the bridge to the question about what politicians can do and what kind of legislation or what kind of legislative remedy we could enact in order to address this problem. But Francis Fukuyama, on this question that Mauricio raised about the media, what role can the media play in helping to right this situation?
Well, I think, first of all, the question is a very good one because there's been a lot of focus on social media and online interactions as the source of populism and a lot of our problems. But it's actually the legacy mass media, television and newspapers that also contribute to it. It differs a little bit from one region to another, but I think one reason that people distrust the media is actually the ownership structure. In Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union, after a lot of Western media companies exited those markets, basically the legacy media was taken over by oligarchs. So in Ukraine today, for example, there are maybe 6 or 7 oligarchs that control the entire economy. Each of them owns a TV station and newspapers, and that's really the only channel of information. And so it's not an accident that people don't trust the media. In Mexico, I think you have a very similar problem with non-transparent, kind of oligarchic influence over mass media. The solution for this is not entirely straightforward. I do think that in some countries, public broadcasting is a solution where you have a sufficient degree of public trust in institutions, but in other places, the public broadcasters get captured by powerful economic and political actors, and so that's not a universal recommendation. I think in general, we have to worry about excessive concentration of media power, because that is really what invites manipulation. I call this the Berlusconi phenomenon, because he's really the person that invented this interaction between media ownership and political power, and that's a pattern, unfortunately, that's been repeated in very many countries, and breaking that connection, I think, is important.
You mentioned the Berlusconi effect, which may well be new, but in fact, I mean, certainly in the UK, and the British media has traditionally been owned by, British media is traditionally oligarchical, and we used to refer to the owners of the major newspapers as the press barons, and Britain, by relative standards, has been a fairly successful democracy. So I'm kind of wondering why this phenomenon that we have seen before is more problematic today. Is it the kind of people that are owning the media, Francis Fukuyama?
I don't think, no, I do think Berlusconi really did set a new pattern. It's not just oligarchic ownership of media, but using that ownership to then propel yourself personally into politics, then to become prime minister, and then to use your political power to protect your business interests. And that, I think, is a pattern that we've seen. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, in a way, comes closest to that in his association with Donald Trump, but he himself did not go into politics. But I do think that that's a kind of toxic combination that's been, exploited, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union.
You'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to ask one of the questions put to me is like, do you still believe the history has come to an end? Since people have asked you that every day for the last 30 years, I'm not going to ask it to you. But I am going to ask Sandra Breka to follow up on what you were saying about media. I mean, Germany has some very big media. I mean, the Axel Springer group in Berlin is a huge media group. I mean, how is the tradition, we can talk about traditional and non-traditional media, and feel free to talk about whichever of those you like, but to what extent is the traditional media in Germany respected by the public?
Well, first of all, I want to say something about conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are not necessarily, in the ownership of Eastern and Southern European countries anymore. We've seen, and I think this is an effect that we've seen over the past 1.5 years, an increase in conspiracy theories where we haven't had them before, fueled by different media outlets, including Germany. So we see this phenomenon, in countries where we haven't had it to this extent before. And while I say this, as you speak of Germany, interestingly, we've also seen an increase in trust in the public broadcasting system. So they've had a considerable increase in viewership over the past 1.5 years, over the pandemic, which means that this public broadcasting system has strong value, and still, thank God, has, despite all of its criticism, all of the criticism we have towards it, has a very strong role to play. We also have, media outlets which are owned in a different manner and have been contributing to certain public opinions and moods. And that is a problem, but I think there are they're very different situations. You have countries where media are completely politically instrumentalized and where you don't have any independent media anymore. You have countries where you have public broadcasting where it can be still be strengthened, and where it plays a very important role, for example, such as Germany. And in order to strengthen media, you have to have a regulation of the digital space of information. And that is actually an issue of the state. If we don't have a regulated space in terms of fake news in what you call the social media or the digital realm, you will not be able to strengthen what we call traditional media, which have seen in most countries a decrease, whether it's the press. Germany is a very different case. We still have regional newspapers which are very strong, as opposed to many in the United States which had to close and saw a decrease in power and support. So you have to look at it country by country, but I really think that regulation in the digital space is relevant, and of information in the digital space will be very relevant to preserving objective sort of information and coverage and countering fake news.
Jakub, in Slovakia and in Central Eastern Europe generally, and please, if you could give us some sense of what is going on right now in Hungary in this respect, to what extent is the media trusted by the public, the mainstream media, the traditional media, trusted by the public here in Slovakia?
I think that Slovakia is an odd man out in comparison to its neighbors to north and south, with public broadcaster relatively uncontroversial and not making waves and relatively trusted. There are some problems around public broadcaster, namely lack of resources and lack of this packaging, which makes the product attractive. As regards Hungary and Poland, to answer quickly your question, I think that the biggest proponents of law and justice in Poland and Orban Fidesz party in Hungary have no illusions that there is a capture by political class of public broadcasting, and they hang on to it as a sort of fruit of the power. But nobody has illusions that this is something that is a standard that they want to be kept once the power changes. And how to redesign it? It's a very tough question. I think that we need a sort of day one, moment zero, when we go back to the drawing table and invent BBC of Poland or Hungary once again. Surely this would mean less of an influence of politicians, maybe some academia represented in some supervisory bodies. We need something like BBC in Poland or Hungary, even knowing the flaws of BBC and criticism in Britain.
Let's be clear that as long as Viktor Orban's Prime Minister of Hungary, that's never going to happen, is it? I mean, isn't Hungary an example of where the digital revolution actually comes storming through for democracy, and that is the only place that civil society can go to actually mount a challenge?
Yes, this is a very strong dilemma, where if you don't regulate, you have all these populist and crazy people present which vie for the attention of the population, and they capture this population. If you regulate, you have tendencies on the part of some dictators who can try to capture the power and make themselves electable for another term.
This is a good segue into a question that I have on my tablet from one of the viewers, from Ayman Mahana, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. And the question is, and we'll start off with Sandra, if I could, can trust and democratic dialogue be restored if social media giants maintain their current business model, which favors echo chambers? Sandra.
Well, the echo chambers are obviously a huge problem. And what we have seen over the past 1.5 years, that what we normally have as individuals, we have our private space, we usually have what we consider our workspace, and we have a public space has been restricted to a private space, both physically and digitally. That has increased to polarization and to distrust. Now, you have to have more regulation, obviously, but you also have to start investing in mechanisms which, as I said before, allow for citizens of different views and backgrounds to interact. And this is hard work. This includes actually, a very inclusive and participatory approach. This also means that you have to work across sectors. one of the groups actually least looked at is are adults who are in the workforce. We invest quite a bit of effort in young people and their education, which is very important. And education is sort of the backbone of a society and of the future of a society. But we rarely look at the large group of people who are in the workforce. So how do you reach these people? It's actually through their employers. We have to think of new mechanisms to reach out. Whether this is possible without dismantling the monopolies of the large, social media platforms is difficult to say. I guess these platforms have a huge pull. I know many politicians are looking at regulation efforts and how we can counter these echo chambers that we have. But all of us, both civil society, government, but also business and all of the sectors have a responsibility to engage. And this is where the multi-stakeholder and cross-sectoral approach really comes into play. We have been largely playing lip service to that. We find it's important, but what we do is usually done in parallel, even though many partnerships have increased. So we have to think of new mechanisms and actually get to people where they are. We cannot expect people to come to us and to open up.
We're very rapidly running out of time, but this question of social media. Of course, Facebook very recently upheld a ban on Donald Trump for 2 years, and Mark Zuckerberg may well be brilliant at technology and business, but he probably doesn't have the same acumen in politics, because if Donald Trump gets into power in 4 years' time again, Facebook is finished, I would suggest. You can't take sides like that without repercussions. Francis Fukuyama, I mean, is this, my American history may be wrong, so correct me, but I believe it was 1911 when Standard Oil was broken up in the most famous antitrust piece of legislation in American history. Is there a danger for the tech companies that really they've annoyed everybody in politics? In Washington, D.C., they're very unpopular, that they're going to get taken down?
Well, opinion on antitrust has shifted 180 degrees over the last few years, and now you get both conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats that are really distrustful of the power of the big platforms. But I don't think antitrust law is actually going to be a way forward because it really only deals with economic and not with political harms. It's very slow. Politically, it's very fraught. It took 10 years to prosecute Microsoft in the last big high-tech antitrust case. And I think that there have to be other kinds of solutions, either through privacy law. I have my own proposal as a result of a Stanford working group on this subject to create a layer of competitive, what we call middleware providers, to which the platforms could outsource the moderation of political content so that they are not responsible for it. But I think that given the polarization of American society, the kinds of regulatory approaches that have been undertaken by the EU or by individual European countries are simply not viable. We can't agree on how to regulate because, Republicans and Democrats have completely different objections to what the platforms are doing.
Jakub, a final word. I wish this conversation could go on for another half hour or another 2 hours. It'll certainly go on for years. What do you think the politicians should do? What sort of legislation is going to make a difference in terms of restoring trust? Mm-hmm. Very briefly, with really 30 seconds.
Okay, I think that the answer will sound banal, but we need to educate people and we need to make them love objective data so that they are resistant to populist arguments. I think that COVID has provided a huge lesson that people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, at the end of the day, they feel that they've lost touch with society, with reality, and the society is able to see through their arguments. So as long as we have proper data, proper indicators, people will be able to choose who is representing and who is electable government and who is not.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Francis Fukuyama, for joining us at this early hour from California. Thank you very much, Sandra Breka from Berlin, and of course, Jakub here for hosting, for your organization hosting this conference in Bratislava. Our Masters of Ceremony, Maitri and Terry, will come on the stage any second to say goodnight, but I'd like to thank you once again for a great discussion.